Leonard Greer was fired on a Tuesday morning, in front of 41 people, for something he didn't do. He hadn't abandoned his post, he hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't shown up drunk or argued with a supervisor or filed a false report. What Leonard had done, what his termination letter would later describe as a pattern of unreliable conduct incompatible with the standards of Caldwell Precision Engineering, was walk through the front door of the facility at 7:43 in the morning instead of 7 o'clock. 43 minutes. That was the entirety of it. The woman who fired him was named Victoria Ashford. She was the plant director, 41 years old, and she had taken over the facility 8 months earlier with what she called a zero-tolerance approach to what she called accountability. The staff had learned, over those 8 months, that what she meant by accountability was a very specific thing. It meant that whatever she decided was the rule, and the distance between her decision and its consequence was shorter than most people expected. She delivered the termination in the main corridor between the machine floor and the loading dock, where the shift change meant there were people moving in both directions. She didn't do it there because she was cruel. Exactly. She did it there because she believed that visibility was a form of message, and that a message sent once in front of many people didn't need to be sent again. Leonard stood in front of her with grease still under his fingernails from the night before. His jacket was zipped to the collar. His eyes were the particular kind of still that comes not from calm but from a person who has learned, over a long time, that reacting doesn't help. He said, "I can explain where I was." Victoria Ashford said, "I'm not interested in explanations. I'm interested in the time you were scheduled to be here." He said, "There's something you should know first." She handed him an envelope and told him his access badge would be deactivated by end of day. She walked away before he could say anything else. The night before had begun, as most significant nights do, without any warning that it would be significant at all. Leonard had been at the facility until 2:15 in the morning. That wasn't unusual for him. He had worked at Caldwell for 11 years, starting as a line mechanic when he was 26, and eventually becoming the senior diagnostics technician for the Precision Systems Division, which was a title that meant he was the person they called when no one else could figure out what was wrong. He had a particular relationship with broken things, with the specific language of a machine that isn't working right, the vibration in a housing that doesn't match the vibration in the manual, the sound that shouldn't be there, the heat that's reading 2 degrees higher than it should, and nobody can explain why. He didn't talk about this much. He just knew things. He had a daughter named Ruby. She was 7 years old and she liked horses, and she kept a photograph of her mother on the nightstand beside her bed, turned so that it was the last thing she could see before she fell asleep. Her mother had died when Ruby was 3. A car accident on I-76, coming home from her sister's house in February, black ice, nothing anyone could have done. Leonard had received the call at 4 in the morning, and he had sat in the kitchen of their house in Brentwood for a long time without turning on the lights. He did not discuss this at work. He mentioned Ruby occasionally, the way parents mention children. A photo on his tool chest, a Tuesday in March when he'd left at 5 because of a school thing, but he didn't talk about what it meant to be raising her alone, or how he organized his days around her schedule, or what it cost him. In the small practical sense, every time something didn't go as planned. The night before he was fired, the thing that didn't go as planned was the Ashford car. Victoria Ashford drove a 2019 Aston Martin DB11. It was her father's car, technically. He had died the previous spring and left it to her, and she had not yet decided what she wanted to do with it, and in the meantime she drove it. The car had begun experiencing intermittent power loss under load, a problem that several shops in the area had looked at without resolution. Her assistant had brought it to Caldwell's internal service garage 2 weeks earlier on the understanding that someone qualified would assess it. Leonard had been asked to look at it, not directly by Victoria, She probably didn't know he existed in any specific way, but by the facility manager, Douglas Crane, who had asked as a favor. Leonard had looked at it once, identified what he believed was a compromised fuel pressure regulator interacting with a fault in the secondary ECU mapping, and submitted a preliminary assessment through the internal system. That was the first assessment. What he discovered the second time he looked at the car, late Sunday night, the night before the Tuesday firing, was different and worse. He had gone back to the garage around 9:30 that evening because something in the preliminary assessment had been bothering him. A reading that didn't quite make sense. The kind of thing that a person less careful than Leonard would have filed away as a rounding error, would have attributed to the age of the sensor or the ambient temperature in the garage, or a dozen other reasonable explanations. Leonard didn't do that. He went back. What he found, when he pulled the secondary ECU module and ran a full diagnostic sequence, was not a fault in the mapping. What he found was a deliberately introduced irregularity. Someone had accessed the ECU, not remotely, physically, with a tool, and altered a parameter in the fuel delivery curve in a way that was subtle enough to avoid triggering an error code, but significant enough to create exactly the problem Victoria had been experiencing. The car wasn't malfunctioning. The car had been interfered with. He sat with that for a long time. Then he corrected it. Because the car needed to be corrected, and it was in front of him, and he knew how. He worked through the night, running the correction, verifying the fuel delivery curve across the full RPM range, resetting the ECU parameters to factory spec, road testing the car in the facility's backlot at 2 in the morning to confirm the power loss was gone. It was gone. The car ran the way a car like that is supposed to run. Which is to say it ran like something designed by people who understood that a machine could be both beautiful and serious. He logged everything in the internal service system and went home at 2:15 in the morning. His neighbor, a woman named Phyllis, who was 68 and had watched Ruby in the morning since she started school, called him at 6:40 to say she'd fallen. Not badly. She'd tripped on the step down to her back patio. But she was shaken and her wrist hurt and she couldn't drive Ruby to school, and she was sorry. She was very sorry. But could he figure something out? He figured something out. He called the school, arranged for Ruby to go in with a classmate's mother, drove Ruby across town to the classmate's house, and got back in his car. He arrived at Caldwell at 7:43. He walked in through the front door and Victoria Ashford was standing near the badge reader, which was the kind of coincidence that feels, afterward, like it must have been arranged, though it wasn't. She had her jacket on and her badge around her neck and an expression that suggested she had already decided something. She had. He had been late 3 times in the past 14 months. She had documentation of all 3. She had been waiting for a 4th. "Mr. Greer," she said. He said, "Good morning," because he didn't know yet what was coming. She told him. Douglas Crane found out at 7:55 when one of the floor supervisors texted him that Leonard had just been walked out. He read the text twice and then called Leonard's cell phone, which went to voicemail, and then he drove to the facility from the municipal planning meeting he'd been at since 6:30 and arrived at 8:20 with what could only be described as a focused kind of anger. He went directly to Victoria's office. Douglas Crane was 54 years old. He had worked at Caldwell for 22 years. He had hired Leonard, trained him through his first 2 years, and had, though he would not have used this word, something approaching reverence for what Leonard could do. He had also, in 8 months of working alongside Victoria Ashford, developed a careful and precise assessment of her management style, which he had shared with no one. He knocked twice and walked in. Victoria looked up from her computer. He said, "Tell me about Leonard Greer." She said, "His termination was processed this morning. He had a documented pattern of tardiness, and he was in this building," Douglas said, "until 2 in the morning, working on your car." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Victoria said, "What? Your Aston Martin." The one in the service garage, he found something wrong with it. Not the thing the preliminary assessment identified. Something else. Something that somebody did to that car deliberately. He corrected it. He logged everything. He road tested it in the back lot at 2 in the morning to confirm the fix held. Douglas paused. Then he went home. Then his neighbor fell and couldn't watch his daughter, so he drove his daughter across town. And then he came to work 43 minutes late. Victoria was quiet. "He didn't tell you any of this," Douglas said, "because you didn't give him the chance." The thing about the deliberate interference with the ECU was that it didn't go away just because Leonard had corrected it. If anything, the correction made the question louder. Douglas Crane pulled the service system logs that afternoon and confirmed everything Leonard had recorded. The timestamps were there. Entry at Niantic sequence initiated, ECU module accessed, parameter irregularity identified and documented, correction applied, road test at 2:07 a.m., exit log at 2:19. Every step. The kind of record-keeping that a person only maintains when they've learned that details matter and that the truth, without documentation, is just a version of events. But there was a second thing in the logs. The original preliminary assessment. The one Leonard had submitted 2 weeks earlier, the one that had identified the fuel pressure regulator issue, had a note attached to it from someone in the internal systems department. The note said the assessment had been reviewed and that the recommended repair had been approved for scheduling. A standard note. Except that the timestamp on the note was from 3 days before Leonard submitted the assessment, which was not possible unless someone had accessed the record and altered the metadata. Douglas sat with that for a while. Then he went back to Victoria's office and told her what he'd found. She listened to all of it this time. He noticed that she was different in the second conversation than she had been in the first. In the first conversation, she had been contained in the way that people are contained when they are managing the distance between what they feel and what they intend to show. In the second conversation, she was just listening. The containment was gone. When Douglas finished, she said, "Who else has access to service system records?" He said, "I've already started pulling the access log. There are 4 people with administrative permissions. I've flagged a T." She said, "The car was in the service garage for 2 weeks." He said, "Yes," she said. "And the irregularity in the ECU, what would have happened if he hadn't found it?" Douglas thought about how to answer that. The way it was set up, he said, it would have gotten progressively worse. Under high load, highway speeds, certain RPM ranges, the fuel delivery would have become erratic, could have stalled, could have caused an accident. The room was very quiet. "He knew that," she said. "It wasn't a question. He's the best diagnostic technician I've ever worked with," Douglas said. "He knew exactly what it was, and exactly what it would do, and he stayed until 2 in the morning to fix it." Victoria looked at the window for a moment. Then she said, "I need his address." Leonard was in the driveway of his house in Brentwood, replacing a loose bracket on Ruby's bicycle, when a black sedan pulled up to the curb. He looked up. Victoria Ashford got out of the passenger side. She was not wearing her jacket. She looked, in some way he couldn't precisely identify, smaller than she had in the corridor that morning. Ruby was in the backyard. Leonard could hear her talking to the neighbor's dog through the fence. Victoria walked up the driveway. She stopped a few feet from where he was kneeling by the bicycle, and she said, "Mr. Greer." He stood up. She said, "I owe you an explanation." He said, "I think you might have that backwards." She absorbed that. "You're right," she said. "I do have that backwards. I owe you more than an explanation." She paused. "Douglas told me what you did last night, what you found, what the logs show." Leonard didn't say anything. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He waited. "Why didn't you tell me this morning? When I was standing there, why didn't you tell me what you'd done?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You'd already decided. I could see it. There are people who are ready to hear something and people who aren't. You weren't ready," she said. "You're right." "I know," he said. She said, "That's fair." He said, "What do you need from me?" I need to understand what you found in the ECU, she said. The full picture. Because there's a metadata problem in the service logs, and Douglas thinks there's someone inside the building who had access to that car for 2 weeks and knew it was mine. Leonard was quiet for a moment. He picked up the wrench he'd been using and turned it over in his hand. I need to get Ruby inside first, he said. Give me 10 minutes. He brought her inside, set her up at the kitchen table with her homework, put a glass of orange juice next to the homework, and came back out to the driveway. Victoria was still standing there. She had not moved to the car. He noticed that. He told her everything he'd found. He walked her through the diagnostic sequence, the parameter irregularity, what it would take to deliberately introduce that kind of alteration without triggering an error code, what it would have eventually done to the car. He explained it the way he explained things to people who were intelligent but didn't know his field. Clearly, without condescension, pausing to make sure she was following. She followed. When he finished, she said, "You knew this wasn't a mechanical failure." "Yes, and you fixed it anyway. You didn't report it first. You didn't wait for authorization. You just fixed it." "The car needed to be fixed," he said. "Whatever was going on around it, the car itself needed to be fixed." She said, "Because I drive it." He said, "Because it was in front of me and I knew how." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you going to make this easy for me?" she asked. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean," she said, "are you going to tell me that you forgive me, that you understand the pressure I was under, that you know I was trying to maintain standards? Are going to give me the version of this that makes me feel better?" Leonard thought about that. He thought about the corridor that morning, the 41 people, the envelope, Ruby's voice coming through the backyard fence. He said, "No, I'm not going to do that." She said, "Good." The access logs took 4 days to fully untangle. What IT found, when they looked carefully, was a pattern of access to the service system records that pointed to a single administrative account that had been used outside of normal business hours on 3 separate occasions over the previous 2 weeks. The account belonged to a man named Clifford Payne, who was the procurement coordinator for the Precision Systems Division, Leonard's division, and who had, it would emerge, a connection to the Ashcombe Group, a consulting firm that had been competing with Caldwell for a regional manufacturing contract worth several $1 million. The Aston Martin was Victoria's father's car. Her father had sat on Caldwell's board for 15 years before his death. The car in the service garage had been a known quantity to anyone paying attention. The interference was designed to look like an accident, and an accident would have created the kind of legal and reputational exposure that Ashcombe had been waiting for. None of this was immediately provable. Some of it would remain in the category of strongly suggested rather than fully established. But enough of it held up that the board was informed, the contract with Ashcombe was reviewed, and Clifford Payne was put on administrative leave pending an investigation that would continue for several months. Victoria presented the findings herself. She was precise and she was thorough, and she did not minimize her own role in what had happened, meaning her decision to terminate Leonard in the corridor that morning, before asking a single question. She described that decision in the board presentation as an error in leadership judgment, and she said it in the same tone she used to describe the technical findings, without inflection, without the particular softness that would have made it easier but also less credible. Douglas Crane, sitting 2 seats to her left, did not say anything during this portion of the presentation. He didn't need to. Leonard came back to work on a Thursday. Douglas had called him Wednesday evening to confirm the reinstatement, the back pay for the days missed, and the formal removal of the termination from his record. Leonard had listened to all of it and said thank you and hung up, and then sat at the kitchen table for a while after Ruby went to bed. He thought about his wife, about the way she had understood, before anyone else in his life had understood, that he was a person who needed to see how things worked. Not to control them. He wasn't a person who needed control, but to understand them. She had called it his particular gift, and also, occasionally, with affection, his particular curse. She had meant that he saw too much, sometimes, to look away. He thought about what he'd seen 2 weeks ago when he pulled that ECU module. The alteration had been good work, technically. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. That had not made him angry exactly. It had made him careful. He drove to work Thursday morning and arrived at 6:52. He badged in. He put his jacket on his chair. He made coffee in the break room, because he always made coffee in the break room, and the machine needed someone who understood its particular eccentricities, and no one else had ever learned them. Victoria Ashford walked into the break room at 7:15. This was not her usual route through the building, and both of them understood that. She said, "Good morning, Leonard." It was the first time she had used his first name. He poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. She took it. She said, "I wanted to ask you something. About the car." He said, "Sure." She said, "After you fixed it, after you'd run the full test and the power loss was gone and you knew it was right, did you drive it? Off the lot?" He thought about the back lot, the 2 in the morning, the way the car had felt when the fuel delivery was finally clean. He said, "No." She said, "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. Through the window of the break room, the floor was coming alive. The first machines warming up, the shift change in progress, the particular sound of a facility that had been waiting for the day to begin. He said, "It's your car, your father's car. I fixed it because it needed fixing. That's where my part of it ends." She looked at him. "You could have," she said. "No one would have known. I would have known," he said. She said, "That's," and then she stopped. She held the coffee with both hands. "I'm going to say something, and I don't want you to be gracious about it. I want you to just hear it." He waited. She said, "I should have asked. Before I said anything in that corridor, I should have asked. There is no version of what I did that I can justify, and I'm not going to try." She paused. "I'm sorry, Leonard, not for finding out I was wrong, for not bothering to find out." He heard it. He let it be what it was, without softening it or dismissing it. Then he said, "Thank you." Not graciously, not warmly exactly, just honestly. The way you say thank you when something has been returned to you that you didn't think you would get back. Ruby asked him that evening why he seemed different. She asked it the way 7-year-olds ask things. Directly, without build-up, while they are eating macaroni and cheese and not particularly looking at you. He said, "Different how?" She said, "Like something worked out." He thought about that. He thought about Clifford Payne and the access logs and the board meeting and the corridor and 41 people and the envelope and the Aston Martin at 2 in the morning, running clean through the back lot with the headlights off because he hadn't wanted to wake anyone. He said, "Something worked out." She said, "Good," and went back to her macaroni. He looked at her for a moment, at her small hands, at the photograph of her mother visible on the nightstand through the open bedroom door, at the way she sat at the table the same way her mother had sat, with one foot tucked underneath her. There were things you fixed because they were broken and they were in front of you, and you knew how. There were things you stayed up all night for, not because anyone asked you to, but because they mattered, and you were the person who understood why. He had done that his whole life. He had never needed anyone to see it to know it was true, but it was, he found, a different thing to be seen, a quieter thing. And on a Thursday evening in Brentwood, with his daughter eating macaroni at the kitchen table, and the lights on, and the neighborhood going still, he let himself sit inside that for a while, without explaining it, without documenting it, without doing anything at all, except being present for the particular, ordinary wait of a day that had ended the way it was supposed to.